you want to understand the Cold, there's many ways to evaluate that narrative. And forgetting good and evil, there's a way to evaluate the claim that the West fought the Cold War in defense against Russia. I mean, that's the doctrine. The West was defending itself against the evil Russian, the evil empire, Russia. Monolithic and ruthless conspiracy, as John F. Kennedy called it. And we had to defend ourselves against it. There are very easy ways to check that. Very simple ways. One question you can ask, an obvious question, is what happened when the Cold War ended? What happened when Russia, the Soviet Union collapsed? Simple question. Answer is very simple. Everything went on exactly as before, but with new pretexts. So, for example, a couple of weeks after the Berlin Wall fell, the United States invaded Panama. Well, that's routine. Bombed the slums, bombed the working class areas, killed probably a couple thousand people, instituted basically put in a harsh, brutal client regime, a regime of peddlers, in fact, and bankers. That's all routine. The press loved it and applauded it and so on. Latin America was bitterly condemned. Nobody cared about that. The United States had to veto a unanimous Security Council resolution condemning the crimes of American troops. Nobody cared about that. All completely routine. One change. For the first time, it wasn't blamed on the Russian threat, because there was no Russian threat. Instead, they made a pretext so ludicrous that they collapsed on a moment's investigation. But that was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Again, right after the Berlin Wall fell, and here Czechoslovakia is implicated, El Salvador, which was the leading recipient of U.S. military aid outside of Israel and Egypt, they're a separate category, was the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and had the worst human rights record. That's a standard correlation, goes on regularly. The high command of the Salvadoran army, which is in close contact with the United States, which ran the country, ordered a brigade, a brutal, harsh brigade, Atacado Brigade, which had killed thousands of people already. It ordered them to invade the university, the Jesuit university, and murder the six leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, and anyone else who might be around, so there'd be no witnesses. So they blew their heads off and killed their housekeeper and daughter. This brigade had just returned from advanced training at the John F. Kennedy Counterinsurgency School in North Carolina to upgrade their skills. Well, that's what happens to dissidents in countries like American client states. Something interesting happened right after it. Václav Havel came to the United States right after it, gave a talk before a joint session of Congress, received a standing ovation when he praised the United States as the defenders of freedom, as just illustrated by their murdering half a dozen of his counterparts in a client state. And he's lauded for that in the United States. In fact, I just learned today they're putting up a monument to him in Congress because of this wonderful contribution, calling us the defenders of freedom when we've just been carrying out the horrendous atrocities ending with the murder of 6 leading intellectuals. Well, that's the Cold War. It continued. Right after the Cold War, and this gets to the present, Mikhail Gorbachev made an astonishing concession, quite astonishing. He agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join a hostile military alliance, NATO. You just take a look at the history of the past century. You don't have to go into it, you know it very well. To agree to allow a unified Germany to enter hostile military alliances, tremendous concession for Russia. Now there was a quid pro quo. The U.S. President Bush, his Secretary of State, James Baker, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase. That meant East Germany. They would stay in West Germany. That was the agreement. Immediately, NATO moved to East Germany. Gorbachev complained, naturally, but he was informed by the U.S. government that the promise was only a verbal promise. It wasn't put on paper. And if he's naive enough to accept a gentleman's agreement from the United States, that's his problem. Then Bill Clinton was elected and moved NATO even further to the east. Now it surrounds, it always was on Russia's borders, Turkey's on Russia's borders, but now it's surrounded, almost completely surrounded Russia. Well, that comes up to the present, to the Ukraine. Right now, the U.S. and Europe are pressing to try to integrate Ukraine into the Western system, but also probably into NATO. At least that's what they're talking about. From the Russian point of view, that's a pretty severe security threat. I mean, it's as if the Warsaw Pact was integrating Canada and Mexico into the Warsaw Pact and putting major military forces there. That would be the analog. Of course, nobody uses that analog in the West because it's taken for granted. There's a dogma in the West, an unchallengeable dogma, that the United States owns the world. And if anyone tries to be independent, they're the ones who are causing the problem. That's the whole history of the Cold War, in fact. You take a look at the actual events of the Cold War, and just to continue with briefly this observation about the end of the Cold War. What the end of the Cold War shows is that things went on exactly as before, new pretexts. That's enough to tell you right off that the standard narrative is a fraud. But there's much more than that. There are also the events of the Cold War. What were the events of the Cold War? Well, pretty straightforward. Now, the Cold War was a kind of a tacit compact between the two superpowers, the huge superpower, the United States, the smaller superpower, Russia. They basically agreed that they would not interfere much in the other superpowers' domains. For Russia, the domains were Eastern Europe, the traditional invasion into Russia. For the United States, the domain was the rest of the world, literally. And so there was no great interference, not at all, in fact, when Russia invaded Hungary, or in '68 in Czechoslovakia, Poland in '81, and so on, nothing much. Nor was there any Russian intervention when the U.S. interfered all over the world. Major wars, major invasions, aggression, and instituting brutal dictatorships, military dictatorships, massive atrocities of all kinds, all over the world. Latin America, Southeast Asia, Middle East, everywhere, because that's what the U.S. owns. That's the U.S. domain. And that's the way it goes to that's what the Cold War was about. You simply take a look at the events. That's the way you find out what it was about. Now, actually, the United States is a very open society, uniquely so. So we have an enormous access to internal records, much beyond any other country. And they explain it. They explain exactly what they're doing in the internal documents. The major driving force in American policy right through this period has been to block independent nationalism. That's explicit, straightforward. You have to block independent nationalism which seeks to use resources of the country for the benefit of the people of that country. They have to be integrated into a global system in which their resources are available to Western, meaning mostly U.S. investors, and they have to conform to U.S. policy decisions. Anything that's not that is called radical nationalism, and that has to be suppressed. There's terminology for it. So Henry Kissinger, for example, said the main problem we face is what he called of viruses that might spread contagion. He was speaking specifically about Chile, Allende's Chile. He said that's a virus that might spread contagion. The contagion was the threat of a parliamentary road to social democracy. That's dangerous. It might spread, and we've got to stop it. Well, what do you do when you have a virus that might spread contagion? You destroy the virus, and you inoculate the victims, the potential targets. How do you do that? You destroy the country that's the target, like Chile, impose a military dictatorship, and protect the surrounding region by instituting murderous national security states, kind of neo-Nazi national security states. It's exactly what was done in the case of Latin America. It was done in Southeast Asia. It was done systematically. And that's the core of the Cold War on the Western side, meaning most of the world. On the Russian side, you're familiar with it. Smaller operations of it, much smaller on a similar kind. Those are the events of the Cold War, and that's the logic of the Cold War. And that's exactly why it continued as soon as Russia disappeared, without any change. So just to give you one more piece of evidence which you can look at. Of course, as soon as the USSR collapsed and the Berlin Wall fell, the United States, the Bush administration, produced a new national security strategy and a new defense budget applied to the new situation. And it's very interesting reading. It's also very interesting that historians don't look at it. Try to see if you can find some coverage of it. But you can look at it. It's public. And here's what it said, basically. It said we still have to maintain a massive military system, and not because of the Russians, they're gone, but because of the technological sophistication of third world countries. Literally. If you're a well-trained intellectual, you don't laugh, and nobody laughed. But because of the technological sophistication of the third world, we have to maintain this huge, overwhelming military system, 1,000 military bases all over the world, and so on.